Hey fellas, this is Collin, and since Kyle has made his glorious exit from this university and eventually this country, I figured I would take up his mantle and compare and contrast two games while deciding which game is superior in a segment we like to call Face Off. Usually we like to cover two games within the same genre that are heavily compared to one another, reboots compared to their original counterparts, or sequels. So in this case, I'll be comparing two games that introduce an iconic character in two radically different ways, with each telling entirely different narratives while encompassing almost everything we love about the franchise. For this episode, I will see how the original God of War stacks up against its later entry of the same name, and decide which of the two introduces Kratos in the most profound and entertaining fashion. In 2005's God of War, we were introduced to Kratos for the first time as his deeds and eternal sins were laid bare in his obsessive conquest of Greece while leading the Spartan army. Unfortunately, in a brief moment of weakness in which his life was at stake, Kratos was forced to call upon Ares for assistance in exchange for eternal servitude. It was through this process that Kratos was gifted the iconoclastic chain blades and was able to gain the upper hand. Afterwards, Kratos slaughtered his way through all of Greece in Ares' name, while further alienating himself from his wife and child. In this endless conquest, Kratos unwittingly slaughters his own family after being tricked by Ares. After having done the unforgivable, the village oracle fuses his family's ashes to his skin, thereby earning him the moniker of Ghost of Sparta. God of War was a welcome addition in the hack and slash genre, popularized by the Devil May Cry franchise in the early 2000s, and the genre fit perfectly inside the world of ancient Greece. The stunning locales were also a great benefit, as we hacked and slashed everywhere from Athens, Pandora's temple, while it was being carried by Kronos, and even Hades. It being a hack and slash game, the combat above all else has to succeed, and Santa Monica delivered in spades. Even almost 15 years later, the combat feels fluid and ultimately timeless. The combos feel as satisfying as ever, even while sticking with the tried and true square-square triangle, and what helps bring the combat to even bigger heights are the boss battles and the overall spectacle of the game's aesthetic. God of War lets you know exactly what kind of game it is from the very beginning, as Kratos is forced to kill a Hydra that threatens to sink his ship. And although it's a tired mechanic nowadays, the quick-time events that capped off every boss battle always resulted in Kratos finishing them off in the most over-the-top and gruesome way possible. Even the combat animations still hold up after all this time, but one problem that dogs this game, and most of the franchise for that matter, is that every attack feels weightless. As you thrust your blades halfway across the screen with relative ease and consistently clear out a room full of enemies, you feel like your attacks don't carry the impact that they should. It all feels almost too effortless for the protagonist, regardless of how enjoyable the combat may be. Luckily, this is offset by expertly crafted puzzles that are a near constant presence in the game. The revenge-fueled plot is also more than serviceable for this game, but it causes Kratos to feel a little one-note as a protagonist. While the circumstances that led to his servitude to Ares and his family's death is enough to make you get behind him as a character, Kratos doesn't initially appear to show much depth beyond that. Even some of the best revenge stories showcase a protagonist with some emotional range, but Kratos' rage is perpetual. Granted, it makes for entertaining over-the-top cutscenes and gameplay, but if not for the game's relatively short running time, Kratos' personality or lack thereof would begin to wear thin. Another issue that plagues this game are the fixed camera angles. Even though they help heighten the cinematic aspects and allow the player to view the frame in all of its glory, it's hardly practical for gameplay, especially when it zooms out during climbing and platforming sequences. That being said, God of War is still a great game 15 years later. Everything from the grand vistas of ancient Greece, the combo-focused combat, the fair but challenging puzzles, the revenge-fueled narrative, and the bombastic score that sits beneath it all still makes this game a must-play. But would the franchise manage to top itself 13 years later? Santa Monica developed and released the second God of War of the same name in April 2018. The fact it wasn't just called God of War 4 and its lack of a colon in the title was a clear announcement that this game was to serve as a second introduction to Kratos. While his temper remains, albeit in a smaller capacity, he's noticeably worse for wear this time around. Even if you haven't played the other games, you can sense that he has quite the history and is being weighed down by choices he's made and forces that are beyond his control. This time around, Santa Monica traded the ancient Greece setting for a Norse one instead, seeing that Kratos thoroughly decimated Greece after the events of God of War 3. Basically, Kratos fled to Scandinavia, got married, and had a son. Unfortunately, his wife passed, and he was left to raise their son alone, which is where we begin in this story. But Kratos eventually finds out that he traded one malevolent pantheon of gods and goddesses for another, as he and his son Atreus go on a journey to the highest peak in all the realms to spread the mother's ashes. This game obviously aims for a much different tone from every game before, as it tells a more intimate narrative about a grieving father struggling to raise his son and his struggle to not let his past affect the present. One thing that immediately jumps out at you is that the whole game runs on one never-breaking shot, allowing the cinematics and gameplay to almost be indistinguishable. Although it can appear gimmicky at first, you find that it serves to heighten the intimacy in most of the scenes, especially those where Kratos interacts with his son. Also, Kratos, for a time, no longer bears the chains of chaos, and instead uses the Leviathan axe as his weapon of choice. The axe functions a lot like Thor's hammer Mjolnir, and it adds a lot of depth to the combat, as well as the puzzle solving. Unlike the first God of War, the combat is severely slowed down, and you can actually feel the weight of every attack and his movements. One more mechanic that was added to the combat is Kratos' son himself. At your behest, you can command Atreus to fire arrows from a distance, and throughout the game as he acquires more upgrades, Atreus becomes further well equipped to handle any encounter that comes your way. The mechanic is fun enough on its own, but the game uses these encounters to deepen the bond between Kratos and his son as he gives him pointers for reference later on. Although this God of War aims for a more intimate experience, the spectacle that we expect from this franchise is still here in all of its glory, especially in the boss fights. Like most of the combat, the boss fights aim for a more gruesome and intimate experience as opposed to the Hydra and Ares fights in the first game, but they are nonetheless visually spectacular, especially in the closing cinematics of each fight, in which the QuickTime events are thankfully excluded. Lastly, where the first God of War was a strict linear experience, this one includes a hub area where you can explore the Lakes of Nine to either do side quests or solve various puzzles to acquire upgrades. The RPG elements don't stop there, as you can swap armor pieces in and out, upgrade your axe, and wear various talismans that adds even more to the depth of gameplay. So between the God of Wars of 2005 and 2018, I would have to choose 2018. Although the original God of War is one of the best ever introductions to an iconic protagonist, I think the newer God of War does a better job of telling a compelling and profound narrative. The older Kratos is more introspective, thoughtful, and displays a much wider emotional range than the Kratos in the original game, and is overall a character with far more depth and dimension. The combat is more mindful and methodical with more mechanics and depth of gameplay that goes far beyond combos and button mashing. The one-shot camera creates a visual and cinematic experience unlike any other in gaming, outshining even the God of War games of old. God of War 2018 managed to totally reinvent the franchise and become a touchstone in the gaming landscape itself. And for that, I have to give 2018 the win here. Thanks for watching Face Off. Feel free to hit the like button down below, subscribe to this channel, and follow us on Twitter as ETV Goofing Off. See ya!